Good afternoon again, and welcome to the second panel discussion. We are honored to have Dr. Junaid Kamal Ahmad. We all know him as a renowned economist and currently serves as the World Bank Country Director for India. He will be giving the keynote address, and the discussants are Shamika Ravi, who has already been introduced and was on the last panel, and Dr. Bhaskar Chakravorti, who is well known to most of the people from Tufts, but he's also a non-resident fellow, senior fellow of Brookings Institution. May I request Dr. Junaid?
So, truth be told, the only reason I'm here is because I have a son who graduated from Tufts this last May, who insisted that I could not refuse Brookings' invitation. I have to tell you, it was very interesting. We went visiting schools, and I took him to my alma mater, and he didn't say anything. And then we went and visited Tufts. And I don't know what happens with these young men and women. He walked in, and within 30 seconds, he says, "This is it." I said, "What is it?" Right? But it was fascinating. And that day when we went, it happened that only two families were being guided by the students for a tour, and the student that guided us very proudly. So there was an announcement that there'd be a snowstorm later during the day. So this brave, tough student said, "Don't worry, we never close Tufts down because of snow." And we said, "Fine, that's good." 15 minutes later, we get the announcement, Tufts is closing down. But
That's why you wanted to go there.
That's why you wanted to go there. You're right.
Harvard very rarely.
But what was it that looked different? So my alma mater is Brown. I don't know what made him think one or the other. I still don't know, but
It's a secret recipe that
no one knows. But I can tell you that this young man just absolutely loved his 4 years at Tufts. He just loved it. Each year was a joy for him. So thank you very much, Tufts University. Whatever you're doing well. Human capital. It's very interesting. A decade, maybe decade plus, the conversations between the ministers of education and health and the ministers of finance would be very simple. The ministers of education and health would say to the minister of finance, "Can you give us more money so we can spend more on health and education?" And fundamentally, the Minister of Finance would look at this as social expenditure and one more lobby group coming in for more money. Today, the conversation is slightly different. Today, if I can take it to an extreme, the Ministers of Health and Education can turn to the Minister of Finance and say, "How much economic growth do you want?" Right? And depending on that, you give us the resources that we need. And one of the reasons I say this is we are living in an age where change is happening at an incredible pace. Little did we think that the world's largest taxi company would have no cars that they would own, or the world's largest shopping mall would have no physical presence or would have no warehouses, or the fact that it took IKEA several decades to reach $42 billion of sales globally, and it took Alibaba 15 years to hit 700 billion. It's a world where change is happening fast, and there is a concern that this change is translating into a change in the way the nature of work will emerge. And that uncertainty is causing a lot of doomsday scenario. But in that uncertainty, I think governments are saying, or at least the dialogue has started, that you can't predict that future, right? I mean, Keynes in 1930 said that by 2030, he expected technology to be such that you would have abundance of leisure and time, that people would, just for contentment, spend 3 hours a day to work. That's basically what he thought would happen. And of course, Marx said the most powerful suppression of strikes is technology. Now, 2018, we're nowhere near that kind of scenario. But I think the uncertainty is suggesting to governments, you are not able to control the future, but what you can do is invest in your citizens the human capital they need to actually deal with the uncertainties of the future. So don't worry about the future and what technology will do and whether low-income jobs will come to your country or not. Rather, grab the moment now and invest in your citizens. And that kind of a strategy then asks the question, well, what kind of investments are we talking about? And here, I think the debate that has emerged in the last few years is what are the components of human capital that really prepare you in terms of your life cycle. And I think we in the World Bank, in looking at the lessons around the world, fundamentally have settled on a few elements of what we think contribute to a strong human capital setting. And it's very simple and it's obvious, but luckily we were able to get some of the world's best economists to do correlations and whatnot to come to this conclusion. Well, what's the conclusion? Well, components of human capital linked to productivity begin with what's your probability that you'll survive up to age 5? 2, what is the probability of a 15-year-old surviving to age 60? So survival becomes very important. Another component is, yes, you're going to schooling, and Mark Twain warned us. He said, I never let schooling get in the way of my education. Well, most of these countries seem to have settled that score. How do you create learning-adjusted schooling systems, right? Learning-adjusted years of schooling. So you go to school, but if you do 12 years of schooling, do you get 12 years of learning? Or is it as, and I don't know what the latest ACER report suggests, is it that you go to school for 12 years and you land up learning 5 years of knowledge? So learning-adjusted years of schooling. And finally, the other component of the human capital is what we would call healthy growth, non-stunted growth. And that becomes important. So when you look at these components of human capital, what's interesting for India is when you put India in the international context, is that the expected level for child and adult survival is more or less where India needs to be. Right? Now, you have to put the caveats. The caveats, there is a diversity. India is a huge nation, so there's diversity. But overall, India is doing well. And if India sustains its current levels of investments and improvement in maternal and child health, I think we could reach better than expected levels of child survival. So from a point of view of survival, India is doing well, child survival. In terms of adult survival, I think the challenges that we're seeing in India are curbing the TB epidemic. I think this is extremely important. And in the medium term, probably the big issue is addressing the rise of NCDs and injuries. And it's not only road safety, but including mental health and self-harm. So these are the challenges that we see coming in the future. But I think the two areas where one will need to see what India will be able to do and where they perform way below the potential of the country and relative to international comparison is in the years of learning adjusted years of schooling and the whole story of stunting. These are the two areas. And I think all of us would agree, those who work here in India, that neither of these issues are major policy debates, right? This is something that I think policymakers have absorbed. It's about implementation of programs that really will change the nature of learning adjusted years of schooling and stunting. So for example, in terms of the schooling, India has been successful in terms of access, and right to education has played a big role in that. But even then, there is a bit of a debate because while India launched one of the most important public programs, SSA, Schooling for All, what's interesting is while investments were made in infrastructure and investments were made to bring children to schools, you saw a migration of children from public schools into private schools. So in some sense, the access is a result of both public and private and not just simply public investment. But overall, access is something India has been able to deliver. But this issue that if you do 12 years of schooling, if you do 12 years of schooling, you don't get 12 years of learning is a serious challenge. Now, how do you change that? And I think here India is facing the challenge of how in a changing federal system do you introduce schooling that will lead to this kind of a learning story. Do you do a top-down story? Do you create competitive federalism to really allow schooling to emerge in terms of innovations in different states? I think the nature of federalism and how federalism will unfold, I think is going to be very, very important in terms of how schooling is going to change. There is you're seeing in some parts of India a movement towards getting non-state actors to come in and take over public infrastructure and public teachers to actually change the nature of teaching. Delhi government has really pushed this quite hard. So it's we're seeing this in different parts of the world. Charter schools in the United States, England has gone very much at scale and bringing in non-state actors. And I use the word non-state actors as opposed to private schooling is because of the whole nature of the way the design of these programs, where it is public infrastructure. They are the teachers in the public sector, but they're under different management and under different systems. I have to tell you what was extraordinary. I went to see one of these schools, School in New Delhi. My daughter is a teacher at KIP, charter school in the United States. It is extraordinary that what I saw at KIP and what I saw here, it was just almost a reflection of each other, but a very different type of schooling. And the students that were there, it was a fascinating story. It is a public school that progressively lost all of its students, and it finally came down to literally 15 or 20 students left in the school with the public teachers and the school buildings. And over the last 2 years, the school has now brought back students, and there are 500 students there. And these are sons and daughters of the security guard, the bus driver, and so on. Entirely different way of teaching, and the accountability is different. The financing, unfortunately, is not sustainable. Government has given the buildings, government pays for the public teachers, but any type of investment, operations and maintenance, the school has to go and get philanthropy to fund, as opposed to a program where government of Delhi could easily say, per pupil, this is what we're going to give you, and now you achieve the type of outcomes that we will write a contract around. But I think how such different type of schoolings emerge is going to be a challenge. And I think in my opinion, the approach of centrally sponsored schemes, which kind of lay down the norms from top, is not going to work. You've got to allow states to innovate and for the center to reward that innovation rather than drive the norms of schooling from above. But fundamentally, it has to drive towards how do you turn around the wicked problems of governance and accountability in teachers, in the principals that run the schools. How do you invest in the capacity of teachers? This is extremely important. But more important is the whole issue of the first 1,000 days, from 0 to 1,000. How do you invest in expecting mothers? How do you invest when the child is born to prepare the child? Clearly, the whole area of early childhood intervention, that is fundamental both to the stunting story as well as to the learning adjusted years of schooling. And here, the big victory is you've seen a shift in the political commitment towards nutrition and stunting in general. So the whole program of Swachh Bharat, sanitation, is really one of the most incredible programs of reversing stunting that we see. But again, the challenge is not the decision to move in the direction of better sanitation or better nutrition programs. The challenge is in implementation. So if you take the ICDS program, for example, this includes more than 1 million Anganwadi workers. The issue is how do you make sure that these workers really focus on the most impactful interventions, perhaps the first 100 days, and move away from just simply providing food to actually investing in behavior change, exclusive breastfeeding in 6 months, for example. All those are the type of changes that are at the ground level. How do you incentivize that? How do you monitor that? How do you make sure that works? That's, again, an issue of not working from the center's funding. Funding is there. It's getting states and local governments to interface with non-state actors to try to get communities into the story. I'm from Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, we've been able to make a huge difference in stunting, coming from very much from several angles. But a major part has been, number one, and I consider them the heroes of Bangladesh, are the remittance workers. The first wave of workers that went to the Middle East sent back their money, but because it was the men that had left, the money came directly into the hands of women. That's when the revolution that started in Bangladesh in terms of family and household changes. Because one of the things that we know is that it's not sufficient to have government intervention vis-a-vis households, but what happens inside the households? Does the daughter get access to the type of services that they need, right? In Bangladesh, what was incredible was because the men had gone to work in the Middle East and the money was coming in the hands of women, it completely changed the household expenditure inside and the way young girls were being supported in terms of nutrition, access to schooling, and so on. So how do you begin to change that? What I think is the next frontier, which is improving the status of women within and outside the household, is fundamental both to the learning story as well as to the stunting story. We in the World Bank are working at different levels. We are working on sanitation. We're working on primary education. We're working on the non-state actors in service delivery. We're also working on adolescent girls' empowerment programs, particularly in the eastern side and northeast, because with connectivity and transport improving, what we find is the girl child is targeted in terms of sex trafficking and other very difficult parts of our society. And there we found that bringing young girls together in programs that invest in their agency is extremely important in this human capital story. So fundamentally, for us, the challenge that India faces on a global comparison is not on the survival side. It's really on the stunting and learning side, and it's not on policy decisions that really the challenge lies. It's an implementation of programs in a federal system and how that will emerge. The last point I would like to make is on the skillings side. And here too, Government of India has huge programs on skillings, but exactly how do you change the skilling program to meet the changing nature of work that we are seeing globally? Again, it's a challenge of implementation, but here I think there is also a challenge of thinking through how the normal 12 years of schooling fits into a skilling period. I think the story of you go to school for 12 years and then you go for the job market is long gone. The constant movement from schooling to skilling to jobs, that constant cycle has to be brought in. And I think schooling around the world is beginning to try and understand how to do that. And I think that the Skillings Ministry is facing these challenges. And again, in a federal system where job markets are so different around the country, how do you actually get skilling going? You again have to go to the local level to come up with a skilling industry that works. But I tell you, some of the chief ministers are making the right decisions. Take, for example, the chief minister of West Bengal. She signaled to the skilling ministry that she does not want the skilling certificates to be issued by any unit in West Bengal. She says, I want it to be a national certificate. Why? Because she clearly wants her citizens to be able to get a job in Maharashtra or in Delhi or in Kerala. So you want a skilling system and a skilling certification that enables the type of migration within the country that's possible. So bottom line, human capital today in a world of change is not just about expenditure, social expenditure. It is fundamental to the economics of a country. And for India, the challenge is implementation of some of the most important programs around stunting, around learning, around skilling. And I think how innovation happens at the local level and how competitive federalism enables that, I think is going to determine how human capital will contribute to India's growth path. Thank you very much.
So just housekeeping first. We have 15 minutes remaining, I guess. Kabir? 15 minutes. 15 minutes total. Okay.
Feel free to speak for 15
No. So we'll do a 5 and 5, and if there are some comments, and maybe Junaid can respond. Very quickly, great listening to you, Junaid, again. I think that emphasis on human capital, I do think India has been lacking in the emphasis on human capital as a prerequisite for sustained growth. We are behind the curve when it gets to investment in health education, and I would add, also because I missed this in the last panel, gender. It's very important for us as a society and an economy to also invest in women. And I will give you some statistics as to why I think it's an acute problem and why for sustained long-term growth, we have to get the women back into the labor force in a sustained manner. But let me first start out by saying, so it's health, education, and gender. In terms of health, I think we've done phenomenally well as far as those indicators that we are watching, infant mortality, maternal mortality. We need to now start thinking about human capital also from the perspective of not just education in the primary sector, but also increasingly on secondary and tertiary sector. One of the reasons why so many bright Indians have to look outside to great universities nonetheless, but look outside and pay these high costs of education is because we just do not have the required number of universities within India which can provide the quality education. So that constraint has to be relaxed if we are to take our gross enrollment rate in higher education anywhere close to China. And so that remains largely, again, a market failure. I do think we have some experimentation, like the Indian School of Business, one of the partners, and where I've taught for 10 years. But those are really small experiments. To take them to scale still requires government involvement. We do need many more centers of excellence which can retain some of this talent back into the country. And I think that must be a policy priority. On the gender bit, what I'd like to say is I think the most telling indicator of gender inequality is the sex ratio in the population. It's a culmination of so many things that are wrong in a society. We have done a lot of research using this and trying to make sense of what is driving to the adverse sex ratios that we see in many of our districts in the country. Now, there is a natural sex ratio, of course, and nature demands that many more boys are born because survival rate of boys is lower than girls. However, if you begin to look at the life cycle of average Indian citizens, then it worsens in the first 5 years because infant mortality is also not gender neutral. In fact, we do have many more girls dying than boys, and one of the statistics where we have not made the kind of gains we ought to have is infant mortality under 5 for rural girls. So while we seem to be doing well, infant mortality is measured in very many different ways, and we're really doing well on all those counts. It's declining across the board. But when it comes to rural girls, there we haven't made the kind of gains we ought to have. The second is also premature girls. Premature girls in rural India almost definitely don't survive. So we are also now getting a handle. The data is telling us that we can actually target our interventions, because if you have a targeted intervention, the gains are going to be phenomenal. The second is if you move beyond 5 years, then a lot of girls succumb to anemia. That is the time when they attain puberty and we're not giving enough nutrition. And that's why nutrition is now health and nutrition. In India, we speak now jointly, largely because of all these various schemes which do recognize that nutrition is a fundamental part of healthcare. But now if you take the life cycle further, maternal mortality remains one of the largest killers of women in India. A lot of it is avoidable. Giving birth is not a disease, it ought not to be. But we really have maternal mortality as one of the largest killers of women in India. You extend the life cycle further, around the age of 45 to 65, it's access to healthcare. And that's the statistics earlier we were talking about. If you look at AIMS, 40% of female patients are not coming. If men and women were to come in equal probability to seek tertiary care, which is practically free, you should have had 40% more women seek care, and they're not coming. So now, if you look at the overall life cycle of an average Indian population, the gender ratio keeps getting worse and worse. So it is not the general fallacy I think we've held on to is, as society we prefer boys. So it's not the boy preference. If it were, then that sex ratio should have become normalized at some level and stayed constant. But it isn't so. Gender inequality resurfaces in access to care, access to education, access to labor markets. In fact, India is an anomaly. Most countries, including South Korea, Taiwan, where you've had gender-related concerns and gender ratios have been perverse, still, even in those countries, as the countries grow, labor force participation of women has traditionally increased. We are an anomaly there. With growth, many more women are dropping out of the labor market. That's a big concern. So we have to now look at policy initiatives, and it cannot be limited, though I think India is far more progressive than the US here. This is going back to the last panel. We actually do have mandated maternity leave of 6 months. It's a paid maternity leave. Now, the problem in a labor surplus economy like ours is it makes the cost of employing women that much more higher, and therefore, the recruiters generally internalize these distortions into their recruitment decisions. So young women in childbearing age our often asked question of, well, are you married? Do you have a husband? Are you thinking of having children? Where do you want to settle? All those things which are blatantly illegal. But let me tell you, as a part of the Apex Business School here, faculty, I do know that my students do get asked those questions, and that's because the recruiters are just being rational in an economy where policy is making it more costly, though it is very progressive, but it's distortionary. So we're also saying that perhaps with maternity leave, make paternity mandatory. Let it be an equal cost. It is a cost to society, but look at it. It's a social cost for a social benefit. After all, the benefit to society of having kids cannot then just be borne by the women. It really has to be a shared responsibility. So there are very many policies, I think, on gender where we're still scratching the surface. I think on health, we've made tremendous gains. And as Junaid said, education, mostly in access, but the quality is still a concern. And I think that is where a lot of top-down experimentation in various states are underway, and it's in a very exciting phase to be studying the Indian human capital market. Thank you.
Okay, how do you follow that? Maybe I can speak a little bit to my colleagues who have traveled from the United States. And one thing that might be crossing your mind is, why are these Indians so down on India so much? And so if if we can sort of collect all the concerns we raised about the state of public health and now the state of human capital, write them down on a long, big sheet of paper, and actually it could be a very thick pad. And please hand them over to my dear friend K.V. Ipan, who's the Secretary of the Ministry of Public Grievances. And he will take care of all of this. And Ipan is a dear classmate, and he wears his years much more lightly than I do. But let me just kind of provide a few glimmers of good news, in order to balance some of the very valid issues that Junaid and Shamika, you raised. One piece of good news was this morning I attended, Junaid, you referred to it, the launch of the ASAR report. ASAR stands for Impact. It's also an acronym for, I've now forgotten, All India Survey of Education Results. Yeah. So, and this is an evaluation that's done by the primary education NGO in India, and arguably the gold standard for the world. And what they have done is not only launched a scalable model of education, not just primary, but going into all the way into skilling. And they've done this across India. Now they're replicating this model to other parts of the developing world. Just an amazing and astounding accomplishment in a very short period of time. But along with the work that they have done, they've also been measuring the impact. And I'll give you, this is a very thick report which I'm carrying in my bag if anybody wants to lighten my load. I'm happy to share the paper version with you. But one thing that I took away, they had a very spectacular launch of the report, and they're indeed proud of the work that they have done in gathering the data. I think there was something like 30,000 volunteers who spread out across India to measure, is our children learning, as President Bush II said a few years back. And indeed, it turns out that our children is learning, because I'll give you a couple of vignettes. They had on the screen the education ministers from two states, the state of Maharashtra and the state of Uttar Pradesh. So those of you who are familiar with the disparities of the different states in India, Maharashtra, not too bad, and they actually came out quite well in this evaluation. So that wasn't a kind of a big surprise. But Uttar Pradesh, this is a state that, and for one, it's the largest state in the country, and arguably it's a country in and of itself. Not just because of the size, but also because it's so distinctive in its culture and the many societal opportunities and challenges that are just resident. It's a human capital case study in and of itself. And Uttar Pradesh has actually done well. So I think fantastic. Then they have a number of graphs in terms of learning adjusted education, and you can see the percentages going up in terms of seventh grade children being seventh grade children who can read up to the 5th grade or up to the 6th grade. Those percentages are actually going up. So this is some good news. The trajectories are up, obviously not uniformly, but on several key dimensions. Another dimension in which the trajectories are up is on girls who are getting educated, and again, learning adjusted metrics. So piece of good news. And I'm also proud to say that this whole analysis was actually started by another classmate of Eapon's and mine, Rukmini Banerjee, and enormously proud of the work that she and her organization are doing. So that's kind of one piece of good news. Another piece of good news is that at the Fletcher School, we've been doing a bunch of different analyses on how digital technology has had an impact on lives and livelihoods around the world. And we've been studying how digital technologies have enabled governments to meet their policy goals, and we've looked at how India has fared relative to global benchmarks and relative to benchmarks created with countries that are kind of within the aspirational zone of India. And in the area of human capital development, both from the perspective of health care measures and educational measures, India has actually, that's one of the areas where India has actually shown some significant improvement. So that's another, there's a delta there, which is a piece of good news. And a third piece of good news is, if you think about the impact of digital technology and the effect that it has on gender inclusion. And one could argue that the access to the mobile phone, which has been quite dramatic, not just in India, but across the developing world, one could argue that the access to the mobile phone is a means of empowerment, not only for anybody who is in a disadvantaged situation, but particularly for women, because they have access to resources of the outside, access to educational resources, potentially access to finance, and then that sort of translates into a variety of good things. Now that's the positive side of the incursion of inroads that digital technology has made. On the negative side, since digital technology is now being made available, or mobile technology is made available both to men and women, there is a hypothesis that men, actually get preferential access. So women could have a mobile phone, but they can't go on the internet, whereas the men can. So, so that actually exacerbates the gender imbalance. So what we did was we actually studied what the impact of the penetration of digital technology has been on gender inclusion. And the good news here is a 1% increase in digital penetration has translated into a 2.5% increase in our measure of gender inclusion. And that is consistent across the developing world, and particularly in India. So that's my third piece of non-submission to the Ministry of Public Grievances. So I think there's some remarkable insights, Junaid, from you. I learned a lot about the fact that stunting is along with learning and skilling, learning adjusted education and skilling, that stunting takes its place as one of the most significant things that you're tracking. So thank you for your insights, and thank you, Shamika, for your insights as well.
Thank you. May I now invite the panelists for the final discussion for the evening, the conversation. Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon. Well, he hasn't come yet, so maybe we can take some questions.
To Bhaskar. Oh, wow.
To be answered.
Oh, I thought you needed the questions. I haven't needed the questions.
Sorry, while we wait for Ambassador Menon, we can address some questions to the panel.
Yeah, I have a question for Junaid. Junaid, I think one of the key aspects which is missing from a discussion, and I like to bring out from an example of ours. I teach in one of the most premium institutions in India where we select 20 students and thousands of students apply for those seats. And unfortunately, what is completely deregulated is the process by which the students get in. So the person who is helping them to get into the institute gets a salary 10 to 20 times more than what I earn in the institute. So this treating education too much like a public good, not having a for-profit experiment to let it come in, is preventing to a certain extent expansion of human capital. Because there's too much of this. If you look at the coaching centers, I mean, they're just expanding, they're unregulated, expanding, and they're actually good. You know, when I teach the first year students, they've actually learned a lot in those coaching centers. I'm sometimes amazed at the quality of students we get. So I think, shouldn't the World Bank be discussing some of those policy issues rather than always trying to get the government to solve the education problem? Because there is a sort of a mafia in education now, you know.
Well, I have to tell you, one of the things that I'm very proud of is that my father and I opened Bangladesh's first private university. And we did that was because of what I would call the inefficiency, the corruption, and the politics in public universities in Bangladesh. How do you use private sector to actually create benchmarks, to support accountability, competition is very important. But at the other end of the story, the rise of private universities in Bangladesh has now led to another series of corruption within the private universities. So for me, the fundamental story, which is really the anchor of what I'm pushing the World Bank to do in India, is how do you invest in state capability? State capability to manage service delivery, which should be one where you create both public, private, and non-state actors to come in. So I think a lot of the question you're asking is not really a public-private question. It's really about how do you create state capability and state accountability. And that's the perspective we take, not that public is a solution, but the state is fundamental to the delivery of these services and changing the ability of the state to manage that.